The filing error was 2 characters transposed in a routing code. A Sulan administrative assistant on her 3rd shift in 30 hours had typed my cohort designation as VT3S instead of VT3J, and nobody caught it for 11 days, because the Vel-Thanis examination citadel processes 4,000 candidates per cycle, and nobody was looking at the human child in row 37 of the junior intake registry to make sure his paperwork was clean. By the time anyone looked, I was already on the bus. Not a bus, actually. A transit pod, sealed, pressurized, smelling of something between cedar and ammonia that I had decided not to think about too carefully. 40 minutes out of the junior residential compound, heading toward the examination district on the far end of the administrative plateau. I had a knapsack with a change of clothes, my registration tile, a water flask, and the 2 mechanical pencils my mother had packed because she didn't trust the ones they issued. She was right not to. I'd used the issued ones in the junior qualifying round. They smeared. The transit pod deposited me at the Vel-Thanis examination citadel at 4:30 local, an hour before the senior certification cohort was due to arrive. I stood on the approach apron in the gray pre-dawn cold and looked up at the building for a while. It was enormous in the way that only administrative architecture can be enormous. Not dramatic, not threatening, just vast, as though the people who designed it had been given all the stone in the world and the instruction to make something that would still be standing in 3,000 years. There were columns. I counted 18 of them across the front facade before I got bored and went inside. The interior was warmer, lit by strips of bioluminescent material set into ceiling channels that produced a light exactly the color of an overcast morning. The floors were some kind of dark polished aggregate that reflected everything slightly, so the hall seemed twice as tall as it was. Rows of examination desks ran the full length, narrow, pale surfaces, each with a tray for materials and a small display inset into the upper right corner for timing and instructions. I counted approximately 200 desks. The front third were the small format ones, Senior Cadet Standard, which I would later learn were sized for species averaging between 1.8 and 2.4 meters upright. I found row C, seat 14, which was mine according to the registration tile, and sat down. The desk was too tall. My feet didn't quite reach the floor. I was aware of this. I decided it wasn't important. A proctor came by at 4:40, a Vel administrator in gray, triple-jointed at the knee, with a face that was mostly smooth cartilage and 2 small dark eyes set very wide. She stopped when she saw me, looked at her tile, looked at me again. "Candidate designation VT3S, seat C14, she said. Her translator rendered it in flat academic galactic standard, the way all the administrative communications had sounded since I got here. "Yes," I said. She looked at the tile again. Her processing pause was long enough that I noticed it. "Your registration shows senior certification cohort," she said. "I know," I said. "You are," she consulted the tile, 12 standard years of age. "Yes." Another pause. Her eyes moved from me to the tile to me. I got the sense she was running some internal calculation and not finishing it. "The senior certification examination is designed for cadets of Tier 3 standing and above," she said. "The standard completion age for this examination is between 19 and 24 standard years." "I know," I said. "Your enrollment record reflects a junior classification." "There was a filing error," I said. "My routing code got transposed. Someone's looking into it." She looked at her tile one more time, looked at me. Her face didn't have the muscles for human expression, but something in the way her 2 dark eyes settled suggested she had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it. "Candidate VT3S is confirmed at seat C14, she said. "The examination opens at 5:30. Materials will be distributed at 5:20. She moved on. I took out my water flask and my pencils and put them on the desk tray and waited. The senior cadet cohort began arriving at 4:45. I heard them before I saw them, voices in the corridor, a sound like something between stone grinding and very low brass, which was apparently how Sulens talked to each other when they weren't bothering to use translators. Then they came through the wide entryway in groups of 3 and 4, and they were large. Sulens are a tall species. The ones entering the hall averaged somewhere around 2 meters, broader in the shoulder than anything I was used to, with a cranial ridge that ran front to back, and gave their heads a slightly wedge-shaped profile. Their coloring ranged from deep gray-green to a pale blue-gray, and their movement had the particular quality of species that have spent a very long time being very confident that nothing around them poses a serious threat. They took their seats in the rows ahead of mine and in the rows behind. Some of them noticed me immediately. Some of them didn't notice me for several minutes, and then did a kind of visual double-take that was satisfying in a small, private way. The one I will call Drevsal, that's not his actual designation, which I could not pronounce then and can barely produce now, was in the 3rd row ahead of mine, seat B8. He was among the larger ones. His cranial ridge was more pronounced than most of his cohorts, and he carried himself with the particular posture of someone who expects to be addressed before he addresses others. He had the look of a person who had spent some years at this institution, and knew precisely what he thought of it and precisely where he stood in it. He turned around at 4:53, once the hall was mostly seated, and looked at me. I looked back. He said something in unsimplified Sulen, not for the translator, just for himself, and 2 of his section mates made a sound I had learned by then was the Sulen equivalent of a short laugh. He turned back around. I took a drink of water and recapped the flask. The examination materials arrived at 5:20, as promised. A proctor distributed them in sealed sleeves, 1 per candidate. I opened mine and held the examination booklet on the desk with both hands because it was nearly as tall as the width of my arm span. 340 questions, 9 sections, printed in Galactic Standard with a secondary column in the original Vel-Thanis formal notation that none of us could read, but which the administrative purists apparently insisted on including for historical fidelity. I flipped through it once, not reading carefully, just getting a sense of the shape. Section lengths varied. Section 1 was short, 30 questions, running about 6 pages. Section 9 was also short, 12 questions, but each one occupied a full page with room for working. The middle sections were dense, with questions that had sub-questions and notation I didn't immediately recognize. Proctor at the front of the hall was a different administrator, older looking, in the sense that his cartilage had calcified slightly around the joint ridges, and his uniform had an extra stripe at the collar that the earlier proctors hadn't. He stood at the podium and gave the pre-examination instructions in Galactic Standard, and then in 2 other languages I didn't catch fully. The instructions were thorough, materials permitted, formats required, procedures for marking unanswered questions, procedures for requesting replacement materials if something went wrong with your booklet, time notification signals, a tone at the halfway point, a tone at 2 hours remaining, a final tone at 30 minutes remaining. He did not mention any procedure for finishing early. There was no language in the pre-examination instructions for a candidate who completed the booklet ahead of schedule, because the sequential exhaustion philosophy did not produce that outcome as a matter of routine. You worked until you stopped, or you worked until the window closed. Those were the 2 states the instructions were written for. Then he said, "The senior certification examination is scored on completion of all 9 sections. Partial completion is not credited. Candidates who complete fewer than 4 sections within the allotted window will receive an automatic non-qualification. The examination window is 8 standard hours. It opens now." The timer in the upper right corner of every desk inset clicked from 0530, 00 to 0529, 59. I opened to Section 1. Here is what nobody had explained to me about the Vel-Thanis Senior Certification. Because nobody had expected me to be here and therefore nobody had thought to explain it. The examination was designed according to a philosophy called sequential exhaustion. The Vel-Thanis pedagogical tradition, which was old enough to have calcified into something approaching religion, held that a candidate's true cognitive ceiling could only be assessed after the easier layers of their knowledge had been fully used up. So the sections were arranged in ascending order of difficulty, and within each section the questions were arranged in ascending order of difficulty, and the whole instrument was calibrated so that the average senior candidate at Tier 3 standing would reach their genuine limit somewhere between Section 6 and Section 7, with the final two sections serving as discriminating measures for the exceptional ones. The theory was that you answered every question in order, working from the front, and you kept going until you couldn't. This was not how I had ever taken a test in my life. My mother was a mathematics teacher. My father had a commercial deep-water welding certification and had taken and passed it on his third attempt after failing it twice, and he had opinions about how to take a high-stakes examination that he had shared with me at length at various ages. My older sister had taken the regional university entrance examination 2 years ago and had scored in the 97th percentile, and she had a system. Various aunts and uncles had certifications, trade qualifications, advanced degrees. The family did not have a mythology about intelligence, particularly, but it had a considerable mythology about examinations, and the central text of that mythology was, "Do not get stuck." The principle was simple. You go through the whole paper once fast, and you answer every question you can answer without pausing. If you hit one you're not sure about, you mark it and skip. If you hit one you genuinely don't know, you mark it differently and skip. When you've been through the whole paper once, you go back and work the ones you marked uncertain. When you've cleared those, you work the ones you marked unknown, because by then you've warmed up and you sometimes find that you know more than you thought you did when you were cold. And if you finish all of that with time remaining, you go through it one more time and check. This is not a complicated system. It is not a sophisticated system. Every human who takes examinations seriously learns some version of it eventually, if not from family then from school or from a book, or from the accumulated cultural pressure of a species that has been sorting itself by examination result for long enough that it has opinions about methodology. The Vel-Thanis examination tradition, 4 centuries old, had never developed it. This is because the sequential exhaustion philosophy assumed that skipping questions was not a valid approach, that going back to a question later, after encountering subsequent material, introduced a kind of contamination. The examination was designed to measure what you knew at each point in the cognitive sequence, not what you knew at the end after you'd had time to warm up and reconsider. The official Vel-Thanis position on examination methodology was that a candidate should proceed from question 1 to question 340 in order, and stop when they could proceed no further. I did not know any of this. I just did what I always did. I went through section 1 quickly, flagging 3 questions I wasn't certain about and 1 I didn't recognize at all, and finished the section in 14 minutes. Then I moved to section 2, and then section 3, scanning each section at reasonable speed and marking what I needed to. I had section 1 clean in my first pass, marked about a dozen things in sections 2 and 3, began to hit real resistance in section 4. Section 4 was applied mechanics and structural theory. Some of it I could do. Some of it was a notation system I'd seen in the junior course materials but hadn't gotten to in any depth. I marked generously and kept moving. Section 5 was harder. It was a reasoning and systems section, long chains of conditional logic, the kind of problem where if you make an error in the third step you carry it forward and every subsequent answer compounds the mistake. I was careful here, more careful than in section 4, but I still marked a number of questions and moved on rather than stall. The skill, my sister had explained, was knowing when you were spending good time and when you were spending bad time. Good time was time that produced an answer. Bad time was time spent staring at something you couldn't move until you had more context, and the context was somewhere else in the paper. I had not appreciated how true that was until this examination. Some of the Section 5 conditionals turned, I would discover later, on a definitional framework that Section 7 introduced. If I had sat on Section 5 until I resolved every mark, I would never have seen Section 7 at all. Section 6 was harder still. Formal abstract notation I didn't have a full vocabulary for, but which I could sometimes parse by analogy to other systems I'd seen. I moved through it deliberately, answering what I could, flagging the rest, not spending more than 90 seconds on any single question that I couldn't start to move. If I hit 90 seconds and was still looking at a question with nothing, I marked it unknown and went on. I was on Section 7 when Drevsal turned around the first time. I noticed it from the corner of my eye, the slight rotation of his large frame, the way his head came around, the brief pause. The hall around me was quiet in the way that large rooms under examination pressure are quiet, which is to say full of controlled, suppressed sound, the scratch of styluses on booklets, the occasional half-suppressed sigh, the soft click of desk timers. The Sulens around me worked with the intensity of people who had trained for this examination and who knew its weight. Section 7, I was in trouble in a more fundamental way. The questions assumed a level of specialized knowledge that I simply hadn't encountered. I answered what I could 8 questions with confidence, marked 6 as uncertain, left the rest with a small notation in the margin about why I was leaving them. Not notation problem, knowledge gap. The distinction mattered to me, though I couldn't have fully explained why. It felt like the honest record of where I was. I had been working for 2 hours and 17 minutes. I looked up once and met Drevsal's eyes, the pale, wide-set ones that Sulens have, and then looked back down at my booklet and kept working. Section 8 had questions I could answer and questions I plainly could not, and I marked accordingly. The applied mathematics in Section 8 was within my range, mostly. My mother had been thorough, but the applied physical theory that followed it went somewhere I couldn't follow with confidence. I marked more than I would have liked and kept moving. Section 9 had 12 questions. I answered 4 with confidence, marked 4 as uncertain, left 4 blank, and wrote a note to myself in the margin in small letters. Check notation key in Section 2 may apply here. It was a long shot, but the notation in those 4 questions had the same structural shape as something I'd seen in Section 2, and if I was right about the relationship, there was a chance. I had been through the entire paper in 3 hours and 9 minutes. I went back to the front. The questions I had marked uncertain in Section 1 were easy on revisit. I'd been cold at the start and had second-guessed myself on the first 2, and the third one had a phrasing I recognized now from something I'd encountered in Section 5. I cleared the Section 1 marks in 11 minutes. Section 2 took longer. 3 of the marks I'd made there were genuinely uncertain, and I worked through them carefully, writing small reasoning chains in the margin the way my sister had taught me, externalizing the logic so I could check it. I cleared 2 of them. The third I left marked. I was midway through revisiting Section 3 when I became aware that the hall had gotten quieter. Not all at once, gradually, the way a room gets quiet when something is happening that people don't want to be seen noticing. I kept working. What I didn't know then, and only understood later when someone explained it to me, was that there was a timing display at the front of the hall, a secondary screen above the podium that showed, for administrative purposes, what section each candidate was working on. This was a routine administrative tool used by the proctors to monitor progress and identify candidates who were falling seriously behind, so that the post-examination attrition report could be prepared accurately. The display had not been updated to account for a candidate who was not proceeding in section order. So what the display showed, from the perspective of anyone looking at it at approximately the 3-hour 20-minute mark, was a section-by-section progress grid with 47 candidates marked as being in Section 3 or earlier, 11 candidates in Section 4, 6 in Section 5, and 1 candidate, seat C14, whose section marker had apparently malfunctioned because it was not currently displaying a consistent section number. It had been in Section 7. Then it jumped to Section 1, then it moved to Section 3, then it went back to Section 2, then, puzzlingly, Section 4. The senior proctor had noticed this at the 3-hour mark and had come to check my desk for an equipment fault. He had stood behind me for approximately 90 seconds, watching me work through a revisit of Section 1, Question 12, before concluding that the equipment was not faulty. He went back to the podium without saying anything. I found out later that he had also looked at my progress display long enough to confirm that every section of my booklet had writing in it, and that the section I was currently in, Section 1, had a different quality of writing in it than it had shown on his earlier pass when he'd glanced at the grid and seen me in Section 7. He had recognized, in other words, that I was not confused. I was not lost. I was doing something the display system had no category for. He went back to the podium and apparently watched. Drevsal turned around again at 3 hours and 50 minutes. This time he looked at me for longer. There was something different in it, not contempt, exactly. Something more like the particular expression a person gets when they are watching something that doesn't fit the category they have prepared for it. He had started the examination with a clear model of the 12-year-old human child in seat C14. Misfiled, out of place, a minor administrative embarrassment that would resolve itself at the first scoring review. That model was getting harder to maintain. I had finished my Section 3 revisits and was back in Section 4, working through the questions I had marked uncertain. Some of them I could pick apart more carefully now. The mechanics problems I had flagged as notation system problems turned out to use a variant notation that I had, in fact, encountered before in a different context. Junior track problem sets from 2 grades above mine that my mother had given me one long holiday when she'd run out of other things to challenge me with. I couldn't always remember why I'd done them. I could remember what the notation meant. I cleared 9 of the 17 uncertain marks in Section 4. Section 5 was where things got harder on revisit 2, but I had time and I was not in a hurry, and I worked through the reasoning chains the same way. The conditional logic problems rewarded care. 3 of the uncertain marks I had made on first pass became clear on second look, because I had more context from the later sections and could see what the questions were building toward. I cleared them. 5 others remained genuinely uncertain, and I decided not to spend more time on them. The return on further investment was diminishing. The hall was noticeably quieter by the 4-hour mark. Some candidates had clearly finished, not because they had completed the examination, but because they had reached their stopping point and were sitting, as the Vel-Thanis tradition apparently expected, in front of their booklets, waiting for the examination window to close. A few were still working, heads down, with the posture of people who knew they were running out of road but were not ready to stop. The air in the hall had changed. That's the only way I can describe it. Early in the examination it had been charged, the particular kind of energy that a room full of competent people who know they are being tested carries, focused and slightly taut. Now it was different. The ones who had finished had let the tension go, and the ones still working were tight in a different way, the way of people doing the last hard yards. I was in Section 8 on revisit, working through the applied mathematics. The physical theory I had largely abandoned, too many knowledge gaps, too little I could do with more time. But the mathematics section I could chip at productively, and I cleared 4 uncertain marks and left 3. At 4 hours and 22 minutes, I finished my last revisit of Section 8. I went to Section 9 and worked the 4 uncertain questions I had marked there, and got 2 of them. Then I checked the margin note about the notation key and confirmed that it did, in fact, apply to 2 of the 4 unknowns. The relationship I had noticed between Section 2's notation and Section 9's structure was real, and working through it carefully gave me enough of a purchase on those two questions to make a genuine attempt at them. One of those attempts I was fairly confident about. The other I was not sure of at all, but it was better than a blank. I was done. I went through the booklet one more time from the front. This was the check pass. I moved through it steadily, not hurrying, reading each answer I had written and confirming I still agreed with it. I found two places where I had made arithmetic errors and corrected them. I found one place where my reasoning chain had a gap that I hadn't noticed, and I wasn't sure whether the conclusion was still valid. I left it as was, because I didn't have a better answer, and changing it to something I trusted less was not an improvement. At 4 hours and 43 minutes, I put my pencils in my pocket and closed the booklet. The hall was very quiet. I sat for a moment and looked at the closed booklet in front of me. The thing about examinations, the thing my father had said, and that I had never really understood until this moment, sitting at a desk too tall for me in a room full of alien cadets on a cold administrative world at the far edge of wherever we were, is that the test is not about you and the questions. It is about you and your own ceiling. You can get everything right and still not know what your ceiling is, because you never hit it. You can get things wrong and still push through to something real. I didn't know if I had gotten it right. I had gotten as far as I could get. I picked up my booklet and walked to the front of the hall. The senior proctor was at the podium. He watched me come down the aisle between the rows of examination desks. The candidates I passed did not look up, mostly. They were in their own worlds, working or waiting, but a few did, and I felt the quality of their attention, which was different from the quality it had been 4 hours ago. Nobody in that room had a word for what they were looking at, I suspected. The display system hadn't had one either. I placed the booklet on the proctor's desk. He looked at it. He looked at me. He looked at the hall timer, which read 3:17 remaining in the examination window. "You are submitting," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. He picked up the booklet and turned it over in his hands the way someone does when they are looking for a problem with an object and not finding one. He opened it to a middle section. He looked at the filled pages, the marking system, the margin notations, the two colors of pencil I had used to distinguish uncertain from unknown. He turned to Section 9. He turned to Section 1. He closed it. "You understand that submission is final," he said. "You cannot request materials back." "I know," I said. "You understand that the examination is scored on completion of all 9 sections." "Yes," I said. He looked at the booklet one more time. He put it in the submission tray. "The hall will remain open for the remainder of the window," he said. "You may wait in the candidate anteroom." "Thank you," I said. I walked back through the hall to retrieve my knapsack from under the desk. When I straightened up, I was facing down the row, and Drevsal was looking at me. He was twisted around in his chair, a position that couldn't have been entirely comfortable for his frame, and he was watching me with the wide, pale eyes. I couldn't read his expression with any confidence. Sulen faces are structured around different muscles, and the emotional signals that are obvious to another Sulen are frequently opaque to someone from Earth. But there was something in the set of his cranial ridge that I had learned to associate with a particular kind of attention. Not the contempt from earlier, not the short laugh he had shared with his section mates. Something else, the same thing I had seen at 3 hours and 50 minutes, but more settled now. Like he had finished arriving at a conclusion and was just sitting with it. I picked up my knapsack. He said something. His translator activated a small disc on his collar, standard issue for mixed species environments, and it rendered it in galactic standard with approximately the delay and accuracy I had come to expect from government tissue translation hardware, which was not always quite right, but was usually in the right ballpark. What came out was, "How long did you spend on each section?" I thought about it. "I didn't do them in order," I said. He was quiet for a moment. His cranial ridge shifted slightly, which I did not know how to read. "What does that mean?" he said. I went through all of them first, marked what I didn't know, then went back. The pause this time was longer. Long enough that one of the section mates nearby, the one closest to Drevsal, who had been part of the short laugh at 4:53, turned to look at Drevsal's face, then turned to look at me, then turned back to his own booklet, which was apparently more interesting than whatever conclusion he had just reached. "That is not how the examination works," Drevsal said. "I know that's not how you're supposed to do it," I said, "but it's how I do it." Another pause. "The sequential method," he said, "reflects the structure of the assessment. The questions build on each other, going back." "Changes your answers," I said. "Sometimes. Yes. I caught 2 arithmetic errors on my check pass that I would have left in otherwise, and I found that the notation structure in Section 2 applied to 4 questions in Section 9, which I wouldn't have known if I hadn't seen Section 9 before I did my revisit of Section 2. Drevsal was very still. The cartilage of his cranial ridge had an almost imperceptible variation in its angle that I could not categorize. "You use Section 9 to inform your reading of Section 2, he said. "Yes," I said, "and Section 5 helped me with some of Section 3, and being through all of it once meant I knew where to spend time on the revisit and where not to." His section mate had gone back to his own booklet. The proctor at the front was looking in our direction, but not moving. Drevsal said something in unsimplified Sulen. I didn't know what it meant. His translator didn't render it, which suggested it was either not addressed to me or was something outside the translation profile. "You did a check pass," Drevsal said. "Yes." "After the revisit passes?" "Yes." I picked up my knapsack and walked to the anteroom. The anteroom was a smaller, quieter space off the main hall, with padded benches along 3 walls and a dispenser of warm liquid that smelled faintly like the thing I had decided not to think about too carefully in the transit pod. I did not drink the liquid. I sat on a bench and put my knapsack beside me and looked at the floor for a while. There was a high window in the anteroom's east wall, narrow and set near the ceiling, and through it I could see the sky going from pre-dawn gray to something close to blue. The administrative plateau was at altitude, high enough that the air outside had a particular quality, thin and clear, that made the light look different from anything I was used to. I thought about my answers. This was pointless. I knew that it was pointless. The booklet was in the submission tray, and nothing I thought in the anteroom would change what I had written in it. But the thing about high-stakes examinations that nobody ever tells you is that the thinking doesn't stop when the pencil goes down. It just shifts into a different gear, the gear that goes back over everything you committed to and finds, with perfectly calibrated cruelty, every place where you weren't quite sure. I was not quite sure about 7 answers in Section 4, 2 in Section 5, and 4 in Section 8. I was completely unsure about 2 questions in Section 9 that I had filled in on the basis of the notation structure connection, and mildly unsure about several others scattered through the middle sections. The 4 I had left blank in Section 9 stayed blank in my mind. There was nothing I could do about them, and reviewing them in my head for the next 3 hours was not going to change that. I sat in the anteroom and watched the sky get brighter through the high window, and decided not to check the time until I started to feel restless. The hall timer was visible through a small window in the anteroom door, a glass panel, the kind with the wire mesh embedded in it. I could see the edge of the timing display if I craned slightly to the right. I looked at it twice in the first hour and then stopped, because it didn't help. What I did instead was think about the examination as a structure rather than as a set of answers. My mother did this sometimes when she was preparing her students for tests. She would talk about what the examination was designed to find out, not just what was in it. This one was designed to find ceilings. It was built on the assumption that candidates would exhaust their knowledge in order, section by section, and the point at which they stopped advancing was the diagnostic signal. It was, in a sense, a beautifully designed instrument for its purpose. Sequential, cumulative, ruthlessly calibrated. The problem was that it had never met a candidate who treated the whole paper as a single working space, rather than a road to walk until you ran out of road. I had not approached it as a ceiling finder. I had approached it as a totality to be managed. Ceiling finding and management are different games. The Vel-Thanis system knew how to score the first. I wasn't sure it knew how to score the second. That was what the scoring board was working out right now. In the building on the plateau I could no longer see from this window. I had some sympathy for them. I had handed them a booklet that behaved like nothing in their 4th-century archive, and they would have to decide what it meant. That was genuinely not a simple problem. Other candidates trickled in eventually. The first one arrived about 40 minutes after I did, a Sulan woman, about 22 by apparent age, who came into the anteroom and stopped when she saw me and then chose a bench on the far side. She didn't say anything. Her translator disc was on standby. She looked at the floor and then at the wall and then at the floor again. She had the look of someone who had reached a stopping point and was at peace with it, or at least at truce with it. 2 more came in over the next hour, both Sulan, both in the 20 to 25 range. Neither of them sat near me. The anteroom got quieter in the way that rooms get quieter when multiple people are in them, and none of them want to start something. Every so often someone would look at the wire mesh window to check the hall timer and then look away again. I took a drink from my water flask. I thought about what I was going to tell my parents. Drevsal came in at somewhere around the 6-hour mark. He was not the last, but he was not the first of the heavyweights either. He came through the anteroom door carrying his knapsack in one hand and his water container in the other, and his translator disc was on standby, and he looked at me with the wide, pale eyes and did not move to the far side. He sat on the bench along the same wall as me, about 2 meters away. The anteroom had 5 people in it now, and the quality of the silence had shifted in a way I couldn't quite name. Nobody was looking at the wire mesh window. Drevsal put his water container on the bench beside him and looked at the floor, the way the others were doing. Then he said, in galactic standard, without looking up, "How did you learn to do it that way?" I thought about my father, about the conversation at the kitchen table, the one where he had explained the certification system to me using the family's dining table as a prop. Here is the whole paper. Here is where you start. Here is where most people stop and most people lose time. About my sister's color-coded flagging system, the red for unknown and the yellow for uncertain, and the green mark she put next to the ones she was confident about so she could fly through them on the check pass. About the particular way she had said, "You're not being tested on whether you can answer questions in the order someone else chose. You're being tested on whether you know the material." "Family," I said. Drevsal was quiet for a while. "Your family takes examinations," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "A lot of them," I said. "My mother teaches. My father has trade certifications. My sister just finished university entrance. We talk about it." He seemed to consider this. "We do not talk about examination methodology," he said. "It is considered," he paused. And his translator produced a word I didn't have an immediate referent for, something between improper and impious. The examination reflects the candidate's mind. Discussing the method of examination implies that the result can be engineered rather than discovered. I thought about this for a moment. "But you can get a better result if you use your time well," I said. "That's not cheating. That's just using your time well." "The Vel-Thanis position," Drevsal said, "is that time management is not an examinable skill." "Then why have a time limit?" I said. He didn't answer immediately. His cranial ridge did the small angle thing again. "That is a reasonable question," he said finally. We were quiet for a while. More candidates came in. The anteroom filled slowly. in the way that a room fills when the people entering it are each carrying the weight of something they've just finished. By the time the examination window closed, the hall timer visible through the wire mesh door panel clicked to 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then held there. The anteroom had 31 people in it, which meant that roughly 1/3 of the cohort had submitted before the window ended. The remaining 2/3 had apparently been in the hall when the timer ran down. I thought about that. The Vel-Thanis sequential exhaustion philosophy in practice meant that 2/3 of a highly selected senior cohort had sat in that hall for 8 hours and reached their stopping point somewhere in the middle of the paper. That was the design. That was the intended result. The examination was not supposed to be finishable by most candidates. It was supposed to find the ceiling. I had gotten through all 9 sections in under 5 hours and spent the remainder of the window in the anteroom. I still didn't know if I had gotten them right. The scoring results for a Vel-Thanis certification examination are not immediate. The booklets go to a scoring board, partly automated, partly administered by senior academic proctors, and the process takes between 2 and 6 standard days depending on the cohort size. I knew this going in. I was prepared to wait. What I was not prepared for was the debrief. The senior proctor collected the anteroom candidates at 8:47 and brought us back into the main hall, where the remaining cohort was still seated. The hall had the particular quality of a space where people have been working hard for a long time, a kind of compressed, wrung-out quiet, like the air after a thunderstorm. The senior proctor stood at the podium. "Examination window complete," he said. "All materials have been collected. Scoring will be conducted over the next 4 to 6 days. Candidates will receive individual result notifications through their registration channels." He paused. "There is an administrative note." He consulted something on his lectern, a tile, I thought, though at my distance and height I couldn't see it clearly. This cycle's cohort included a candidate whose examination pathway was atypical, he said. Candidate VT3S completed the examination booklet out of sequential order, including multiple revisit passes across sections. This methodology is not prohibited by the examination code. It is also not recorded in the precedent archive for this examination series. He paused again. Scoring board will note the pathway in the candidate record and assess applicability to result classification. The hall was very quiet. "That's all," the senior proctor said. "Cohort dismissed." Nobody moved immediately. That's what I remember, the moment after he finished speaking, when the hall full of large, experienced cadets who had just spent 8 hours on one of the most demanding examinations in the regional certification system all paused, in the particular way that people pause when they are recalibrating something. It was not a dramatic pause. It was not theatrical. It was just the half-beat that happens when a room that had a complete picture of itself at 5:30 no longer has that picture, and is deciding how to build a new one. Then they began to move, and I walked out with them, and the cold morning air of the plateau hit me at the exit, and I put my jacket on and started for the transit terminus. On the transit pod back to the residential compound, Drevsal sat in the row across from me. We were among the first ones on. There were a few others from the anteroom, and then more as the pod filled. The seat beside Drevsal stayed empty for a while, and then someone sat in it, and Drevsal moved his water container and didn't look up. At some point, we were maybe 20 minutes into the 40-minute ride, the administrative plateau scrolling past outside the sealed windows, he said, still looking at the window. "What was your score on the junior qualification round?" 91st percentile, I said. He was quiet. "I had a 93rd percentile on my junior round," he said. "I was 17. I didn't say anything to that because there wasn't really anything to say to it. He knew how old I was. It was in my record. Everybody in the hall knew how old I was. "My father told me," he said, still looking at the window, "that the senior certification is not about the questions. It is about finding your limit. My father told me, I said, that finding your limit is fine, but getting stuck on question 47 when you could have gotten question 63 is just leaving points on the table. Drevsal made a sound that his translator didn't render. I didn't know what it meant. It might have been a laugh. It might have been something entirely different. His translator disc was on standby. He looked at me then. Really looked, the way he hadn't at 4:53 when he'd made the untranslated comment to his section mates. "How many sections did you complete?" he said. "All 9, I said. The transit pod made a sound, a pressure equalization, I thought, as it descended from the plateau. A soft thump, then quiet. "I completed 6, Drevsal said. "That is my Tier 3 result. 6 sections. I was in the 91st percentile of the Section 6 completers in last cycle's cohort." "That's a good result," I said, because it sounded like it was. "Yes," he said, "it is." He looked back at the window, but it is not 9 sections. I looked at the window too. The plateau was behind us now, and we were in the lower landscape, and there were structures out there. Low, wide buildings that I guessed were the residential compounds of various training cohorts, surrounded by open ground that was either fields or exercise yards. It was hard to tell from this angle. "I don't know how I scored on the ones I answered," I said. "I might have gotten a lot of it wrong." "Perhaps," he said. "The sections I'm least sure about are 4, 5, and 8, some of 9. I left 4 questions completely blank in 9. "Which questions in 9? I told him the question numbers. He was quiet for a moment. "Those are the discriminating measures," he said. "Questions 337 through 340. They are designed to have no correct answer for candidates below Tier 4. They test whether candidates know the limits of their knowledge." I thought about this. "You leave them blank if you don't know," I said. "You leave them with a written acknowledgement that the question falls outside your current competency," he said. "A blank is a failing mark. An acknowledged limitation is a different classification." I thought about the 4 blank entries in Section 9 of my booklet. Then I thought about the fact that the booklet was in the submission tray and I could not get it back. "I left them blank," I said. "I know," he said. "I saw your booklet briefly when the proctor picked it up, the last page." I didn't say anything to that. "It may not matter," he said after a moment. "The scoring board will note the pathway deviation. There is precedent, older precedent, from before the current examination code, for classifying blank discriminating measures differently when the candidate's overall pathway record reflects unusual completeness. It is not a certainty, but it is not impossible." I thought about my father's advice, about the check pass, about the 2 arithmetic errors I had caught. "Do you think it matters?" I said, "the blanks?" Drevsal considered this for what felt like a genuine amount of time, not a polite pause, an actual consideration. "I think," he said, "that the scoring board has not encountered your booklet before, in any form." He paused. "I also think that what you described, the revisit pass, the check pass, the cross-section notation work, I think that when the board looks at your answer pattern they will see it, the coherence of it, the way the later sections inform the earlier revisits. That is a readable shape, even to a scoring system that did not design for it." The transit pod pulled into the residential hub terminus. Drevsal stood the long way up that Sulan stand and picked up his water container. "If you are still in the cohort next cycle," he said, "and you use that method again, the revisit passes, I would like to understand the sequence more precisely." I looked up at him. "I'm probably not staying in the cohort," I said. "Someone's going to sort out the filing error eventually." "Perhaps," he said, "but the examination record will stand regardless." He moved toward the exit with the rest of the cohort. I followed at my own pace. The results came 4 days later. A notification on my registration tile at 6:17, before most of the junior compound was awake. I sat on my bunk in the gray early light and looked at the tile and read the notification twice, and then a third time, because the first two readings had produced a result that I wanted to confirm before I decided what to do with it. The scoring board had assessed candidate VT3S on completed sections, 9 of 9. Questions answered, 261 of 340. Correct responses in answered questions, 214. Questions left blank, the 4 in section 9, marked in the record as, and this was the part I read 3 times, pathway deviation, acknowledged limitation classification pending separate review. The pending review note was because the scoring board had encountered a situation their classification framework did not have a precise precedent for. A candidate who completed all 9 sections, answered substantially in the upper half of the cohort on assessed questions, and submitted at 4 hours and 43 minutes into an 8-hour window. The result was neither a standard tier advancement nor a standard non-qualification. The board had opened a new notation field. It was called, in the formal Vel-Thanis administrative language, something that translated approximately as provisional designation, examination methodology atypical. What this meant in practice was that my result had been placed in a category that did not previously exist in the certification records, and that the academic board would convene to determine what the appropriate advancement classification was, and that in the meantime I was neither junior track nor senior track, but something the Vel-Thanis Citadel had apparently not had to name before. The filing error, when someone finally sorted it out 3 days after the examination, produced a considerable amount of administrative back and forth. The correct routing code should have placed me in the junior track for another 18 months, and several people on the junior academic board had opinions about what should happen next. The senior board had different opinions. The examination records from the certification were not in dispute because examination records at the Vel-Thanis Citadel are permanent, and the result had already been logged under the new notation field. I sat in a waiting room for a long time, while various administrators had various conversations. Eventually, a senior administrator, not the one from the examination hall, a different one, higher up, with a different cut of the gray administrative uniform, came in and sat across from me and put a tile on the table between us. "Candidate VT3S, she said. "Yes," I said. "Your enrollment routing error has been identified and documented. The correct designation is junior track tier assessment pending the junior qualification round result, which you have completed, and which reflects a 91st percentile standing." "I know," I said. "You also have a senior certification examination record," she said, "which falls outside the normal junior track parameters." "I know." She looked at her tile. "The senior certification result," she said, "cannot be unexamined. It is part of your permanent record. The scoring board's provisional notation, pathway atypical 9 sections complete methodology deviation on file, will remain in your candidate record regardless of which track you are formally enrolled in." "All right," I said. "The academic board has determined," she said, "that the appropriate administrative response is to assign you to an accelerated track designation." She named the designation, which I couldn't fully parse in galactic standard, but which she followed with. "This reflects a candidate whose examination record does not fit existing tier classifications. You will have access to materials from Tier 1 through Tier 3, junior and senior, with advancement assessments at 6-month intervals." She put the tile toward me so I could see the screen. "Do you understand the implications of this classification?" she said. I looked at the tile. I thought about my father at the kitchen table, about the regional qualification round, about the examination booklet closed on the submission desk 4 hours and 43 minutes after the window opened. "It means I'm not in any of the existing boxes," I said. "It means we are creating a new one," she said. She said it the way administrators say most things, evenly, procedurally, without particular emphasis. But there was something in the precise economy of it that I thought about for a long time afterward. Not that we do not have a box for you, not that you have broken our system, just, we are creating a new one. I signed the designation tile. She filed it. I was given a new routing code, correct this time, VT3A, though standing for something in the Vel-Thanis formal notation that my registration guide translated as accelerated atypical. I went back to the residential compound and sent a message home. My father replied 12 hours later because of the communication lag. He said, "Good," and then, "Did you do the check pass?" I sent back, "Yes." He sent back, "Good." My mother asked about the food. My sister asked what my score was on Section 4, because she'd always found mechanics harder than algebra. I ate dinner in the junior compound cafeteria that night, familiar food, or the closest approximation the Vel-Thanis catering system could manage, which was edible but not quite right in the way that food abroad is always not quite right. I sat at one of the low tables that had been added to the cafeteria for the junior cohort and ate, and looked at the wall. 3 days after the designation was formalized, I got a communication through the registration system from a senior cadet designation. Not a name, a registration tile number, but I knew who it was. It said, "I looked up your score on Section 4, 71% correct." I sent back, "I thought it would be worse." He sent back, "The Vel-Thanis record for first-time Section 4 completion at age 12, when it is eventually formally registered, will be in the archive. They are still deciding which archive." I sent back, "How long did you spend on Section 4 on your first attempt?" He sent back, 3 hours, and I did it in order. I sent back, "Did you get to Section 5? He sent back, "No, not on the first attempt." I thought about the 4 hours and 43 minutes, the high window in the anteroom, the light going from gray to blue, the proctor standing behind me for 90 seconds, watching me revisit Section 1, and then walking back to the podium without saying a word. I sent back, "My father says that the test is not about the questions, it's about finding your limit." There was a longer pause than usual, long enough that I wasn't sure he would respond. Then, "I think I am beginning to understand what that means." I put the tile down and looked at the cafeteria wall for a while. Outside, through the narrow windows near the ceiling, the administrative plateau was a dark edge against the stars. The citadel was up there somewhere. The submission tray, the provisional notation, the new archive field still waiting for a name. I was 12 years old, and I was in a category that hadn't existed before I walked up that aisle and put my booklet on the proctor's desk. I didn't think of it as winning anything. I had answered the questions I could answer. I had used my time the way I had been taught to use it. I had gone through the paper once and marked what I didn't know and gone back and cleared what I could clear and checked my work and stopped when I was done. That was the whole of it. The rest was just paperwork. But the paperwork, it turned out, was going to last a very long time.